I spotted her before she even realized I was watching. The unmistakable, rigid posture of Karen as she tried to pry open my root cellar door at the edge of the backyard. The same woman who had spent months complaining to the HOA about every little thing, from my garden hose placement to the color of my mailbox, now bold enough to trespass onto my property. And something in the pit of my stomach twisted into a mix of disbelief and adrenaline as I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling but my mind razor sharp, because this wasn't just about another HOA spat. This was a full-blown invasion, a trespasser with her own brand of entitlement written across her face, and I knew that if I didn't act fast, she could slip in, grab who knows what from my cellar, and vanish into her little HOA fortified fortress like nothing happened. And so I yelled out a warning, loud enough to startle a flock of birds into flight. But Karen didn't flinch. She just smirked, that irritating, smug smile that had fueled so many of my late-night arguments with the HOA board, and it was clear she thought this was all some game, that I would simply retreat and let her have her way. But I wasn't raised to back down. Not when someone crossed the line onto my property, not when my family's food, wine, and carefully stored preserves were at risk, and certainly not when it was Karen, the same woman who once wrote a complaint to the HOA about the unsightly way I stacked firewood, now acting like she owned every inch of my yard. So I took a deep breath, my pulse thundering, and slammed the cellar door shut just as she tried to wedge it open with her bony fingers, the metal latch clanging like a warning bell in the stillness of the early evening, and I could see the shock flash across her face, the first crack in her confident facade. And then I dialed 911, keeping my voice calm but firm as I reported the break-in in progress, giving the operator my address and describing her to the smallest detail, the frayed beige cardigan, the oversized sunglasses, the way her hands shook as she adjusted her grip on the door, all of it so precise it could have been in a police sketch, while she glared at me from behind the door as if daring me to make a move. And that was the moment I realized Karen hadn't come alone. A shadow shifted behind her in the dim light, just enough for me to glimpse another figure crouched near the side of my garden shed, silent but moving with the predatory caution of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and my heart lurched because this wasn't just a rogue HOA Karen. This was a setup, someone working with her, someone who knew exactly when and how to strike, and I felt a cold wave of panic mixed with adrenaline, but I refused to show it, keeping my tone casual but firm as I told the operator, "Yes, they're trying to get into my root cellar. I need an officer here immediately," while Karen muttered something under her breath, a mixture of frustration and disbelief, probably convinced I'd chicken out like all the other neighbors she had harassed. And then, without warning, the second figure darted toward the corner of the shed and disappeared from view, leaving a trail of broken leaves and disturbed dirt, and I realized that whoever this was had already scoped out my property, knew the blind spots, the exact location of the cameras I hadn't yet installed, the points of weakness, and that sent a fresh jolt of fear through me, because suddenly this wasn't just a petty HOA confrontation. It was a planned intrusion, and the thought of what they could steal, or worse, what they might do if I confronted them, made my hands grip the phone so tightly it hurt. Yet I didn't hang up. I kept the line open, describing every small movement as Karen fumbled with the latch, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that the cops were on the way, and I remembered the stories from the neighborhood, whispers about HOA members who went too far, about vendettas that escalated beyond fines and warnings, and it hit me that I was staring down one of those moments, the kind that you read about and think, "It won't happen to me," until it's happening, and my mind raced through all the options. Slam the door, retreat into the house, confront her, get my kids inside, call for backup. But before I could act, Karen's foot kicked at the door, hard, and it rattled in its frame, and I swear I could feel the malicious intent vibrating through the wood, and that was when I noticed something strange. Her smirk faltered, her posture shifted, and she looked over her shoulder at something behind her, her eyes widening ever so slightly. Just before the door she had been trying to force open slammed against her shoulder with a metallic echo that rang through the yard, and in that split second, I realized the second figure wasn't just crouching. They had somehow triggered something, a tripwire or some makeshift alarm I hadn't even considered, and Karen stumbled back with a startled shriek, fumbling for her phone or maybe some other tool, but I didn't wait. I bolted toward the door with my shoulder ready to reinforce the latch if needed, my adrenaline reaching a point where time felt like it had slowed, every leaf crunch, every distant car engine, every bird caw amplified in the tense silence, and then I heard the distant but unmistakable wail of sirens, faint but real, and a part of me relaxed, thinking the cops were finally on their way. But Karen, recovering her composure faster than I expected, let out a frustrated growl and lunged at the door again, this time with both hands, and I felt the full force of her determination to get inside, and in that heart-stopping moment, I realized that whatever she had planned was far more dangerous than I had anticipated, and just as her fingers grazed the metal latch, the second figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted in the fading light, moving with a speed that made my stomach drop, and for a heartbeat, we were locked in a standoff, me gripping the door, Karen pulling, and the accomplice closing in, and I thought, this is it. This is the moment that changes everything. Just before the sound of tires skidding on gravel erupted from the street as police cars rounded the corner, their lights flashing red and blue against the darkening evening sky, and in that split second, Karen froze, her face a mask of disbelief and fear, and I realized that while I had called the cops, the real question was whether my quick thinking had been enough to stop them before something irreversible happened, and as the first officer leapt from the cruiser, shouting commands, the second figure vanished back into the shadows, leaving only the echo of their presence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that whatever had driven Karen to break into my cellar in the first place was just the beginning, a prelude to a much larger, more sinister plot that I couldn't yet see, and as the officer approached me, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else, "They're not done," and for the first time, I realized that my fight with the HOA had escalated into something far beyond disputes over lawns and mailboxes, and now it was about survival, vigilance, and uncovering the truth before it was too late. The instant the police cruiser's lights flashed across the yard, Karen's eyes went wide with something between fury and panic, the kind of expression that only comes when someone realizes their carefully constructed plan has just unraveled. But the danger was far from over, because the second figure, the one who had disappeared into the shadows moments before, was still out there, and I could feel it like a cold weight pressing on the back of my neck, a presence that refused to be ignored, and as the officers moved toward Karen, shouting commands that she barely seemed to register, I noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. The smugness was gone, replaced by a twitchy, desperate energy, her hands fumbling as she tried to explain herself, probably thinking that some clever excuse would save her, and I had to bite back the words that screamed at me, the anger, the fear, the sense that all of this, every petty HOA fine, every angry letter, every minor confrontation, had been building to this exact collision, because no one escalates to this level unless they have something far bigger in mind, and my gut twisted with the horrifying realization that I had only caught the surface of it, that the true motive, the real reason Karen and her accomplice had targeted my root cellar, was something I couldn't yet see, but could feel in the back of my mind like a shadow stretching just beyond the edge of light. And even as I watched the officers cuff Karen and lead her to the cruiser, I noticed movement in the tree line at the far edge of my property, a subtle rustling that didn't match the wind or the wildlife, and I froze because I knew instinctively that it wasn't random, that whoever had been working with her hadn't given up, and worse, they might have been watching us the entire time, learning our routines, our blind spots, the way my family always came out to water the plants or tend the garden. And the thought sent a ripple of fear through me, because this wasn't just a break-in anymore. It was surveillance, strategy, a test of my vigilance, and I realized that if I wasn't careful, they could strike again, with far more knowledge and far more daring, and my hands itched to do something, to prepare, to make sure that the next move wouldn't catch me off guard. But at the same time, I had to keep my family safe, and that meant balancing the immediate crisis with the anticipation of the next one, which might come at night, might come when we least expected it, and might come in a form that no one could predict, because people like Karen, people who thrive on control and chaos, rarely act alone or without a hidden agenda, and my mind raced through possibilities. Cameras, alarms, traps, barricades, every defensive measure I could imagine, and yet even with all that, I couldn't shake the sense that something critical had already been missed, some piece of the puzzle that would explain why Karen had been so brazen, so methodical, so frighteningly confident. In her initial attempt, and then it hit me, a detail I had dismissed in the heat of the moment, the second figure's speed, the way they had disappeared into the shadows without a sound, the faint glint I had caught in their hand just before the cops arrived, and my blood ran cold, because whatever it wasn't just an accomplice, it was someone with training, someone who understood how to move silently to evade notice, and potentially to strike with devastating efficiency, and I realized that the stakes had just skyrocketed from neighborhood harassment to something dangerously personal, something that could affect every inch of my property and every member of my family, and as I tried to process it, one of the officers came over, whispering that Karen had given a name, a reference to a project she'd been working on with someone from the HOA board, and my stomach lurched because I recognized the name immediately, someone who had been friendly on the surface but who had always had a suspicious way of asking questions, watching the way we stored our preserves, noting the days we tended to the garden, and I realized then that my paranoia had been justified all along, that the casual inquiries, the friendly visits, had been reconnaissance, preparation for this very moment, and it left me wondering how deep the conspiracy ran, how many people in the HOA were involved, and whether anyone could be trusted. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows. Across the yard, I noticed Karen's shoes sticking out from the cruiser's open door as if she were still trying to reach something, and it occurred to me that she might have been hiding a key, a tool, a note, something that would allow her to return, and that thought alone was enough to make my fingers tighten around the railing, my eyes scanning the tree line, the corners of the yard, the places a second figure could be lying in wait, and then, just as I began to feel a fraction safer with the officers present, one of the cops called out, his voice tense, "Sir, you might want to see this," and I turned to see a small, metal object lying in the grass, just beyond the root cellar door, partially hidden by dirt and leaves, something I hadn't noticed before, and the blood drained from my face because I knew instantly what it was. A lockpick set, or perhaps more than that, tools for bypassing the door. And my mind raced with the possibilities of how long it had been there, how long. Someone had been planning this, and whether it was a signal, a marker, a test left behind intentionally to see if I was paying attention, and as I bent down to inspect it, the hairs on the back of my neck rose because a whisper carried on the wind, faint but distinct, and I could have sworn it was Karen's voice, mocking, taunting, and suddenly it clicked. The second figure wasn't just a silent partner. They were watching, they were learning, and they were patient, calculating, willing to wait. Until the perfect moment to strike again, and that realization hit me like a punch, because now the threat wasn't immediate but inevitable, and the cops could only do so much once night fell, once the shadows deepened, once visibility dropped, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, because I knew that in mere hours, or perhaps even minutes, someone could attempt entry again, with knowledge of my movements, my weaknesses, my routines, and I had to prepare, had to anticipate. But my mind kept circling back to the most unnerving detail of all. Karen hadn't acted alone in the sense of being physically present. She had guidance, someone orchestrating the timing, watching every step, possibly controlling her actions with subtle instructions, and that implied planning that extended beyond my property to my life, my family, and the trust one had placed in neighbors, and as I looked toward the tree line again, certain that movement would appear, I realized the cops were scanning too, flashlights swinging, radios crackling. But the rustling returned, this time closer, deliberate, and I froze because this time, it wasn't a shadow slipping away, it was approaching, and every instinct screamed at me to retreat, to hide, to lock every door, but I couldn't leave the cellar unguarded, and as I whispered a quick warning to the officers, the rustling stopped abruptly, followed by a soft thud behind the root cellar door, a sound so quiet yet so precise it sent a shiver down my spine, and in that heartbeat of silence, I realized that whoever was out there knew exactly how to manipulate fear to test my reactions, to see if I would falter, and as the first officer stepped forward, flashlight cutting through the gloom, the figure emerged. Not Karen, not the second accomplice fully revealed, but someone entirely unexpected, someone I had never imagined in this scenario, holding something that glinted under the beam of light, and the second it caught my eyes, my heart stopped, because it wasn't just a tool or a weapon, it was a message, a warning, and the words scrawled across it made my blood run cold, words I had never expected to see, words that meant the battle wasn't just beginning, it had already infiltrated every part of my life, and I knew in that moment, with sirens wailing, shadows moving, and my family inside unaware of the full scope, that this was bigger than Karen, bigger than the HOA, bigger than anything I had ever faced, and the only question left was whether I could survive what was coming next, or if I had already walked into a trap that had been set. Long before I even noticed the first sign, and as the figure lifted the object higher, revealing the message clearly under the flashlight, my breath caught, my pulse thundered, and the word hit me like a sledgehammer, watching. The moment I saw that single word, watching, etched into the metal plate clutched in the stranger's hand, everything inside me froze, because it wasn't just a threat. It was a declaration, a promise that someone had been studying me, my routines, my property, my weakest points long before tonight, and the realization hit me with such force that for a heartbeat, the world around me blurred, the police flashlights, the rustling trees, Karen wailing inside the cruiser, all of it fading as my brain tried to connect the pieces, but before I could make sense of it, the stranger stepped forward into the beam of the cop's flashlight, revealing a hooded figure with a calmness that terrified me more than Karen's frantic rage ever had, because while Karen acted out of petty power, this person moved with precision, purpose, like someone who had trained for moments exactly like this, and as the officers shouted commands, telling them to drop the object and raise their hands, the stranger did something that made every muscle in my body lock. They smiled, slow and deliberate, as if the police presence meant nothing, as if fear were irrelevant, as if they were simply checking off the next step in a plan already set in motion, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me because people who smile at cops aren't scared, they're confident, and confident people with a plan are the most dangerous kind. Yet before anyone could react, The stranger placed the metal plate on the ground with almost ritualistic care, then pointed directly at me, not the officers, not the cellar, not Karen, me, and mouthed something I couldn't hear but felt in my bones, a silent whisper that tightened the air around us, and the officer closest to them moved forward, reaching for their shoulder, but the stranger ducked, twisted, and vanished into the trees with a speed that made the first cop curse under his breath, and the forest swallowed them as if they'd been part of the darkness all along, leaving behind nothing but the chilling message glinting in the grass, its metallic surface catching the light like an accusation, and as the officers gave chase, shouting into their radios, I stood there rooted to the ground, staring at the word engraved with a precision that felt almost surgical, and my breath came in sharp, uneven bursts as the truth settled in. This wasn't random, it wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. It wasn't even about my root cellar. This was surveillance, long-term, intentional, organized, and Karen had been nothing more than a puppet executing the most visible part of the plan, and suddenly every odd occurrence of the past few months. My security lights flickering at random hours, the strange clicks on my phone line, the feeling of being watched when I took out the trash, the anonymous HOA warnings about areas of my property I'd never shown anyone, began forming a pattern that made my skin crawl, and as I crouched to pick up the metal plate, a cold shiver shot through my spine because I could feel it, still warm, as if someone had been holding it tightly only seconds earlier, and etched into the underside, nearly invisible unless you tilted it exactly right, were GPS coordinates. My backyard, specifically the root cellar door hinge, the exact spot Karen had tried to break into, and as my stomach dropped, an officer jogged back toward me, breathless from chasing the stranger, shaking his head as he muttered that the figure had moved like a ghost, vanishing deeper into the woods before they could catch up, and his words only confirmed what I already feared. This wasn't just a break-in attempt. This was reconnaissance for something bigger, something timed to perfection, something I wasn't prepared for, and when I told the officer about the coordinates on the back of the plate, his eyes darkened, the kind of expression cops get when a situation shifts from annoying disturbance to serious threat, and he called for backup again, this time not as a precaution but as a necessity, and I watched as at least 3 more cruisers arrived, their lights flashing across the trees, casting long shadows that danced like figures watching from the dark, and inside the nearest cruiser, Karen slammed her hands against the window, screaming something I couldn't hear, but her face was twisted, not just in anger, but in fear, real fear. The kind people have when they realize the person they partnered with is far more dangerous than they expected, and suddenly she wasn't the villain of the moment anymore. She was a pawn who had just discovered that she was disposable, and for a second I almost pitied her, almost considered walking over to hear what she was yelling, but when her eyes landed on me, filled with wild desperation, I hesitated, because while she looked scared, she also looked like someone who knew something she regretted being part of, something she desperately wanted to unload before it crushed her, and I took a step forward, intending to approach her, but before I could get close, the headlights of yet another vehicle illuminated the driveway. Not a police cruiser, not a neighbor's car, but a sleek black SUV I didn't recognize, tinted windows, no plates visible from the front, and the moment it rolled to a stop, the officers instinctively reached for their holsters, sensing the shift in the air, and my heart hammered because nothing about the SUV felt random. It felt like the kind of arrival that changes everything, the kind that makes your instincts scream to run, hide, bolt every door, and as the driver stepped out, a tall man in a tailored jacket with an expression as unreadable as frozen stone, I knew immediately he wasn't there by chance, and when his eyes swept across the yard, landing briefly on the root cellar, then the metal plate still in my hand, then on Karen thrashing inside the cruiser, and finally locking onto me, a slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, and something inside me tightened like a knot pulled too hard, because that expression, that silent acknowledgement, felt exactly like the stranger's smile a few minutes earlier, cold, calculated, confident, and he walked toward the officers with the steadiness of someone who believed the world bent to his will, raising a hand as if expecting compliance, but the officers moved to block his path, demanding identification, and he simply reached into his jacket, pulled out a document holder, and flipped it open with a practiced motion that made both officers exchange uncertain glances, and whatever was inside, it carried weight, real weight, because both men stepped back reluctantly, though the tension in their expressions deepened instead of easing, and that's when he shifted his gaze back to me and said, in a voice too calm for the chaos surrounding us, "We need to talk," and every fiber of my being screamed that talking to him would be a mistake, a trap, the next move in a game I hadn't realized I was playing, but before I could respond, Karen's muffled shouting intensified, and she began slamming her shoulder against the cruiser window so violently the officer nearest her snapped, "Hey! "Stop!" But she didn't stop. She kept thrashing, her panic escalating until her voice finally broke through the glass enough that I could make out her words. Don't let him near you! He's the one! He's the one!" Before the officer shut the door properly and cut her off, and the man from the SUV simply tilted his head, watching her with mild amusement, like someone observing an insect trapped in a jar, and then he turned back to me, lowering his voice as he stepped closer and said, "You've attracted attention you shouldn't have," and the way he said it, calm, almost conversational, made it even more terrifying, because it wasn't a warning, it was a statement of fact, the beginning of something that felt irreversible, and as I tried to step back, he reached into his jacket again, pulling out a small black envelope that he extended toward me with the same deliberate precision the stranger had used when placing the metal plate on the ground, and although every instinct told me not to touch it, my hand moved anyway, almost mechanically, because some part of me needed to know how deep this went, needed answers. But just as my fingers brushed the envelope, every police radio crackled at once, erupting with the same urgent transmission. "Units, be advised. We've got multiple signals tripped on the east side of the property, unknown movement. Repeat, unknown movement approaching fast," and the man's smirk widened ever so slightly as he whispered, "Right on time," and before anyone could react, the woods behind the cellar erupted with motion, fast, coordinated, deliberate, shadows converging with frightening precision, and the last thing I saw before officers sprinted toward the tree-line, weapons drawn, was the man stepping back toward his SUV, his expression calm, almost pleased, as though everything happening was unfolding exactly as planned, and as he opened the door to climb inside, he looked at me one last time and said, "You should have sealed that cellar the moment you moved in," and then the door shut, the engine roared, and the SUV peeled away just as something crashed through the trees with enough force to shake the ground beneath my feet. And in that split second, with officers shouting, shadows closing in, and Karen screaming inside the cruiser like she knew exactly what was coming, I realized with chilling certainty that whatever was in those woods wasn't running away, it was coming for me. The moment the ground trembled beneath my feet, not from footsteps but from something heavier, something deliberate, forceful, coordinated, my blood ran cold, because whatever was coming out of those woods wasn't behaving like a person running, hiding, or fleeing. It was advancing with the kind of confidence only something that knew it had the upper hand could show. And before the officers could even organize themselves into a defensive line, the first shadow burst through the tree-line with a speed that made the nearest cop swear loudly, and in the split second the flashlight hit its shape, I saw enough to know this night had just shifted into something far darker than HOA harassment or petty break-ins. A figure dressed head to toe in tactical gear, black, sleek, silent, moving like someone who had trained for operations far beyond suburban neighborhoods, and as the officers raised their weapons and shouted commands, two more shadows broke from the trees to flank the first, positioned with ruthless precision, their movements synchronized like a team that had rehearsed this exact approach, and the realization hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. This wasn't random, this wasn't a two-person scheme, this wasn't even an HOA conspiracy gone extreme. This was a team, a coordinated unit, a group with resources, training, and a purpose directed squarely at my property, specifically my root cellar. And the terrifying truth settled on me like ice in my lungs. They weren't here to run, or steal, or intimidate. They were here to retrieve something they believed was inside that cellar, something they were willing to mobilize for, and as one of the officers shouted for me to get inside the house, I stood frozen, staring at the tactical figures whose helmets had no visible insignias, whose faces were hidden behind visors, whose movements spoke of rehearsed efficiency, and the thought ripped through my mind like lightning. What did Karen think was in my cellar? What could she have told them? What lie had she spread? Or worse, what truth had she uncovered that would justify sending in a team like this? But before I could even begin to unravel the questions, Karen's muffled screams erupted into frantic shrieks that pierced through the cruiser's sealed windows, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes bulging with terror as she screamed words that barely reached me. "Don't let them open it! You don't understand, don't let them!" But her warning dissolved into chaos as the officers fired warning shots into the air, forcing the three figures to halt, for only a moment, because as soon as the echoes of the gunshots faded, the lead operative stepped forward and, without a word, hurled a smoke canister at the ground, filling the air with a thick gray cloud that swallowed the officers, the cruisers, the yard, everything, leaving me blinking through the haze, choking as visibility dropped to almost nothing, and panic surged through me because somewhere in that fog were armed men trained for scenarios like this, while I was just a homeowner caught in the middle of something far beyond my understanding, and I stumbled backward, trying to reach the porch, when suddenly a hand shot out from the smoke, grabbing my arm in an iron grip, and for a split second I thought one of the operatives had caught me, but it was an officer. coughing violently, pushing me toward the house as he shouted, "Get inside! Go! Now!" before disappearing back into the fog to help his partner, and as I staggered into the doorway, slamming it behind me, I sprinted through the dimly lit hallway, shouting for my family to get upstairs and lock themselves in the safest room, but as I reached for the emergency lights, the house suddenly went dark. Every bulb, every lamp, every socket extinguished in an instant, plunging everything into pitch blackness so complete I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face, and dread coiled in my chest because the only way the power could have cut this suddenly, this surgically, was if someone had targeted the main box outside, or had access to something deeper, more sophisticated, like a deliberate override, and my phone buzzed in my pocket, a single vibration, and when I looked at the screen, a message glowed back at me, unsaved number, no name, just 4 words that nearly stopped my heart: "Don't open the cellar." My hands trembled as I stared at the message, because the timing was too perfect, too intentional. Someone who knew exactly what was unfolding outside, someone watching in real time, someone with access to my number, and maybe even my house. And before I could even process it, another vibration buzzed against my palm, but this time the message wasn't a warning. It was a countdown. 20. My pulse surged. Another buzz. 19. Then 18. And suddenly the horrifying truth snapped into place. The countdown wasn't random, it wasn't a threat directed at me. It was a timer, a deadline, a marker for something happening outside, and without thinking, I moved toward the window, peering through the darkness into the fog-shrouded yard just in time to see the tactical unit repositioning through the haze, converging toward the cellar door like predators closing in on trapped prey. And as the countdown buzzed again, 14, I saw one of them kneel beside the hinge, pulling out a tool that glinted faintly even in the low light, something that looked mechanical, high-tech, nothing like a lockpick, more like a device meant for breaching, and my breath hitched because if they got that cellar open, whatever they believed was inside, they would unleash or retrieve without hesitation, and the idea that I had no idea what they thought was inside scared me more than the operatives themselves. But before I could reach for my phone to call the officer who'd grabbed me earlier, a faint creak echoed through the house, coming from the basement stairs, and every muscle in my body turned to stone as I realized with dawning horror that someone was inside the house with me, someone who hadn't come through the front door, someone who hadn't made noise when entering, someone who moved like the shadows outside, stealthy, hidden, calculated, and the countdown buzzed again in my hand. 10. As the creaking grew louder, each step descending toward the main floor with glacial patience, and I backed away slowly, my heart thundering, my breath shallow, gripping the nearest object I could find, a heavy metal flashlight, even though I knew it would do nothing against whoever was coming up those stairs, because these weren't burglars, they weren't petty criminals, they weren't HOA members gone rogue. They were professionals, and the figure emerging from a stairwell confirmed my worst fear. Another black-clad operative, silent, visor hiding there. Face, steps controlled, posture calculated, and they paused at the bottom step, turning their head toward me with mechanical precision, like they already knew exactly where I was standing in the darkness, and my phone buzzed again. 6. As the operative took one step forward, then another, not rushing, not hesitating, simply closing the distance between us with the calm of someone certain of the outcome. And as I forced myself backward, my heel hit the edge of the hallway table, knocking over a stack of mail, one envelope falling open across the floor, and out of it slipped a photograph I had never seen before, a photo that made everything inside me seize. My family and I, standing in the backyard, smiling unaware, but taken from a high angle, from the woods, from a spot we never would have noticed someone watching from. Taken months ago, proof that surveillance didn't start tonight, that it had been ongoing, meticulous, invasive, and before I could even bend to pick it up, the phone buzzed again. 3. And the operative took another slow step forward, and I realized with soul-freezing clarity that the countdown wasn't for me. It was for them, marking the moment the cellar door would be breached, marking the moment something irreversible would happen, marking the moment everything about tonight, the break-in, the stranger, Karen, the SUV man, the tactical unit, would converge into one catastrophic reveal, and the phone buzzed again, 2, as the cellar door outside groaned under pressure, and the operative inside my home reached forward with a gloved hand as if to grab my wrist, my throat, my face. I didn't know which, when suddenly the entire house shook with a deafening metallic crack, a sound so violent it rattled the dishes in the cabinets, and I knew, without seeing it, without needing confirmation, that the cellar door had just been forced open, and the phone buzzed one last time, 1, followed by a final message appearing on the screen, 5 words that made my knees buckle as I read them: "Don't let them find it." And before I could even process what it meant, what they were looking for, What had been hidden beneath my property before I ever lived here? The operative in my house lunged forward. Fast, too fast, and everything went black. When I came to, the world was different. Or at least, the part of it I could see through the haze of adrenaline and fear that still clung to me like a second skin, because the first thing I realized was that I wasn't on the main floor anymore. I was somewhere lower, somewhere colder, somewhere underground, the air thick with dampness, the walls concrete, the faint smell of earth and mildew filling my nostrils, and as I tried to move, my wrists stung from the tight binds holding them, the same ones that had been snapped on with professional precision, padded just enough to avoid immediate injury but sharp enough to make me acutely aware that resistance could be costly, and the faint echo of movement above suggested I hadn't been taken alone. There were others, operative figures moving silently, their black-clad forms appearing and disappearing in the shadows like wraiths, and my pulse pounded because every instinct screamed that the moment my eyes fully adjusted, I would see something I wasn't ready to confront, something I hadn't anticipated in my worst imaginings about Karen, the SUV man, or the tactical unit outside, and as I struggled to orient myself, I noticed a narrow corridor leading deeper into the earth, dimly lit by a single dangling light bulb swinging slightly from a rusted wire, and my mind raced to connect the dots, to understand why anyone would go to such lengths, why this root cellar, a place for preserves, wine, and vegetables, had become the target of what I now knew was an orchestrated, multi-layered operation involving surveillance, tactical operatives, and precise timing, and the thought that maybe, just maybe, the cellar itself wasn't the real prize, but rather what had been hidden beneath it for years, something long forgotten, something with value beyond money, beyond property, beyond petty HOA vendettas, sent shivers down my spine, because it suggested history, secrets, and knowledge that someone was willing to threaten, manipulate, and even abduct to obtain, and as I listened, the sound of footsteps, controlled, purposeful, echoed above, paired with faint, unintelligible murmurs, almost like instructions being passed down through comms devices, which confirmed the horrifying reality that my home and my family's safety were now variables in a much larger equation I didn't understand, and then the voice came, low, calm, unmistakable, cutting through the muffled sounds. "He's awake." My stomach lurched as I recognized it instantly. The SUV man, the one whose arrival had escalated everything beyond HOA and neighborhood conflict, and the fact that he had followed, that he was personally overseeing this operation, made the entire ordeal far more terrifying, because it wasn't just about retrieving something. It was personal, meticulously planned, and designed to provoke maximum fear. And the footsteps above shifted, paused, and then slowly receded, leaving behind a silence that was more deafening than any noise, and in that silence, I realized I had mere moments to assess, to act, to survive, because the operative who had moved me here wasn't leaving me unattended for long, and the thought of waiting passively while these trained professionals orchestrated every move from above made the air itself feel heavy with dread, and I strained against my restraints, testing the knots, the bindings, looking for any imperfection, any weakness, but they were flawless, crafted with a kind of skill that made escape seem impossible, and as I shifted to find a better vantage point, my fingers brushed against the cold concrete floor, tracing the edges of a small object partially embedded in the dust and grit, and when I pried it loose, my heart skipped a beat because it was a tiny key, oddly ornate for its size, old-looking, with an intricate symbol etched into the head, a symbol that resonated with something deep in my memory, something I couldn't quite place but which immediately screamed significance, and the implications hit me like a thunderclap. If the cellar, or whatever was hidden below it, was what they were after, then this key, this object I had just discovered accidentally, was part of the puzzle, part of the reason why Karen, the tactical unit, and the SUV man had all converged on my property, and the realization forced me to reconsider everything I had thought I knew about the conflict, because the HOA angle, the petty arguments, the past complaints, they had all been a cover, a distraction, a smokescreen to hide the real motive, which was older, more mysterious, and far more dangerous than anyone had let on, and as I examined the key, a faint sound made me freeze, a metallic scrape, soft but deliberate, coming from the corridor I hadn't noticed before, leading further down, deeper into the earth, and instinctively, I knew someone or something was approaching, and that it wasn't one of the officers from earlier or Karen's chaotic intrusion, but someone entirely different, moving with a calculated purpose, and then a voice, clear and calm, spoke from the darkness. "I see you found it." My heart stopped, my chest tightened, and I squinted into the dim corridor, trying to locate the source, but the shadows played tricks on my eyes, stretching forms into shapes my mind couldn't trust, and then a second voice, male, deep, authoritative, almost reverent, said, "Good. He's ready." The phrasing, the tone, the emphasis on ready, made my stomach knot with terror, because I suddenly understood that I wasn't just a victim or a witness. I was a participant, an unwitting key player in something far larger, something ancient or secretive, a plan that had been set in motion long before I had ever considered moving into this house, and as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours, the faint glow of another light appeared at the far end of the corridor, illuminating a small platform embedded in the wall, a hatch, with mechanisms and locks that suggested something highly secured lay beneath, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw the symbol on the hatch match the symbol on the key in my hand, and dread surged because the implication was undeniable. This key was meant to open whatever was hidden beneath the cellar, and they had come for it, and I had it, and now, unknowingly, I was standing directly in the path of a revelation that someone was willing to kill for, and the footsteps grew louder, deliberate, approaching closer and closer, and I knew that when the next person emerged from the shadows, it would be the SUV man himself, accompanied by someone even more terrifying, perhaps the hooded figure from the yard, the one who had left the watching plate, or perhaps someone else I hadn't seen before, someone higher up in the chain, someone whose plan this had been all along. And the thought that they had orchestrated everything, used Karen, trained operatives, and even me as pawns, made my mind spin, and then the final horror hit me. The phone in my pocket buzzed again, displaying a single message from an unknown number: turn the key or lose everything. And just as my trembling fingers hovered over the small ornate key, the corridor ahead erupted with movement, shadows converging, shapes forming, and the SUV man's cold, calm voice echoed clearly, "It's time. Now." And I realized, with bone-deep certainty, that the moment I made my next move, whatever lay beneath the cellar, whatever secret had drawn all of these people to my property, would be unleashed, exposed, and there was no going back, because the game that had begun with Karen's petty trespass had reached its apex, and the very air around me seemed to vibrate with the weight of the unknown, of centuries of planning, and of the question that would define my survival: do I turn the key, or do I risk the consequences of defiance? And in that instant, as the footsteps closed in and the shadows stretched to surround me, my hand finally made contact with the cold metal of the key, and the world held its breath with me, waiting, watching, as I was about to make the choice that would change everything.